Okay, right, I'm conscious of time. So first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody for joining us this morning on this sunny Monday morning. I'm Rachel from Pro Manchester. This event's been brought to you by our wonderful Pro Women committee. So huge thanks to them, especially Michelle, because I know you've done a lot of the work in getting this together. Just a couple of housekeeping points. I wanted to let everybody know that we are going to be recording the main session of this. So you might be better for the audio quality to keep yourself muted for that part of the event. And then obviously you'll be unmuting yourself when you're in the breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, so that's completely confidential. It will only be the main session. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Michelle.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Morning, everybody. So my name's Michelle Malani. In my day job, work at EY with privately owned businesses around growth and innovation, but really enjoy my role as part of the group for Pro Women. And what we're really keen to ensure is that how do we reflect what's going on for women across our business community? How can we kind of support your thinking, help bring you together to sort of share ideas? And that was the whole reason we came up with this topic, because we were consistently hearing about how it can be difficult to kind of progress your career. I'm so pleased that Professor Julia Rouse from MMU is going to be able to kick us off with getting our creative juices flowing, even if it is early on a Monday morning. And then we'll break out into our 3 rooms. What I would ask is we all contract with each other, that they're kind of safe places for us to share our thoughts and our views. We might not always agree with each other, but that what goes on in the room stays in the room. And then we'll come back together just to kind of wrap up at the end. But any ideas that anybody has on subjects that we should be thinking about as a Pro Women committee, we're really open to that. So this is for all of us. So thanks very much. I hand over to you, Professor Rouse.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to share my slides. Now, tell me if you can see these, and I'm going to make them. Are you happy? Can you see?
Perfect.
Yeah. I just need to muck around with how I can see you, otherwise I can't see my slides. Okay, brilliant. So thanks ever so much for coming this morning, and it's a nice sized group. I wish we were physically present, but this is we'll do what we can to create that feeling of being women in the room together, and giving that bit of I think sisterly support. And if we've got some men on the call as well, then all the better, because generating roots for women's leadership very definitely does demand that we have the good allyship of men as well. So welcome to you. So I think the reason that I was invited this morning is that a few years ago we did a project called Generating Roots for Women's Leadership, or GROW. And what happened was that somebody who sits on the board at Manchester Met University said to me, Julia, I want to do a report on women's leadership in the North. I'm worried about it. And I said to her name's Vanda Murray. She's sat on various boards. She sits on the Growth board, the Growth Hub board now. And I said to her, Vanda, we can do that if you like. But you know what I'd rather do is try to translate the evidence around what's blocking women's leadership and get it out there into the community. And so we did this project where we developed a toolkit, you can call it, I suppose, but in a sense, it's a folder of materials, which are 10-minute reads that will lay out some of the 6 reasons across the life course, the factors that block women's leadership, to try and ask organisations to ask themselves deeper questions about how they would create more inclusive workplaces. So that's, you can still get to that in a minute. I think I've got a slide on GROW in a second. And if you go MMU.ac.uk/GROW, you can get free access, download the materials. So whilst we're not still actively working on that project at the moment, the materials are completely open access. And in the Sylvia Pankhurst Gender and Diversity Research Centre, we are what we call engaged scholars. So we're really, really committed to translating research evidence and theory and putting it out there to practice and seeing how it lands. And a really key thing about being an engaged scholar is that you know loads that I don't know, because you're all in your complex contexts each and every day, and the world is moving fast all the time. So one of the things that I love about this event is that I'm going to learn as much from you as you're going to learn from me, to see how good the theory is. Does it land? Does it help to explain your lives? Does it help you to think differently about your options? And so Pro Manchester asked me to come and say something about mid-career women, and I automatically start thinking about pay, work-life balance, and getting sponsorship for progression when I think about midlife women. I said I also wanted to come and talk about the body, but apparently you're going to do other events that are going to think about menopause or think about pregnancy. If you're me, one came hot on the heels of the other. It wasn't a big gap. And so I think we do need to think about women's bodies. I think that we've not talked about women's bodies enough. I think we are differently embodied to men, and it's really important that we have workplaces that can be respectful, where we can bring ourselves and our bodies to work. One of the most liberating things that ever happened at our university is when we had a dean who put sanitary pads in every single toilet, because we knew the students weren't coming to university because of sanitary poverty, which is really shocking, isn't it? But also it just meant that you weren't doing this secret thing of squirreling off to the toilet anymore. They were loud, they were proud, they were out there, and we didn't have to be ashamed of our bodies anymore. So I just think there's ways and ways. As women, we've come a long way, but there are still some hidden stuff, isn't there, about the way in which we navigate organisations that aren't that well designed for us at all times. So, yeah, so anyway, Pro Manchester asked me to come on, and I said, well, would you be interested in a left field idea, which would be if I came and presented you with some recent evidence about what is the state of feminism at the moment? What are the different discourses of feminism that are circulating at the moment? And then we try and link that to how can we think about pay, work-life balance and progression. And I was quite pleased that you said, yeah, that would be of interest. So let's give it a go. I mean, this is a bit of an experiment, but I'm always into the idea of trying to see how theory lands in practice. So let's have a go. So I work in two research centres. One's called the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity, and we're really interested in that sweet spot between work, when work can be both decent and productive. And I'm just finishing a massive project at the moment, looking at how do we develop effective training for line managers, because we all know that there's nothing more miserable than having a bad line manager. So we do a range of projects about work, and then within that centre we have a specialist centre on diversity called the Sylvia Pankhurst Gender and Diversity Research Centre. Now, many of you will already know this, but Sylvia was daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. She was the errant daughter, whereas Emmeline Pankhurst stood for the Conservative Party to become a candidate at some point. Sylvia followed her father's socialist roots, and she was one of the force-fed and imprisoned suffragettes for whom we have to thank for our vote. But also, once the vote was won, Sylvia went on to campaign across a range of issues, including working class poverty, and she helped to establish one of the first mother and baby clinics ever in London, in the slums. So she was really, really interested in motherhood, and she was also really interested in work. And I hope you got to see when she was being displayed in Manchester Art Gallery. But Sylvia was an artist, and she, during the periods when they were campaigning for the vote, she went and drew the lives of women at work, which I think is a really interesting record. Sylvia was alumnus of Manchester Metropolitan University because she went to the art school. And that's how come we named our centre after her. And I'm very, very happy that her granddaughter, Helen Pankhurst, is now a professor in our centre. And what I've learnt really from working in the Sylvia, as we call our centre, is really not to be afraid of my activist instincts. Now, I know we all work in organisational settings and we all have to, you know, approximate what professional looks like, don't we? And that can sometimes, I think, make it difficult to speak up. But we use, in Grau, we used a concept called tempered radicalism, which a lot of people seem to like. So I'll just explain tempered radicalism to you. Somebody did some research on what happened to the women at Greenham Common, who are obviously very radical women. And it worked out that they were now in middle management, often in the public sector. You can imagine, can't you? And they were busy raising families and making a living. And when she interviewed them about what happened to all your radicalism, she found that what they would do is they would use their everyday power in the pursuit of equality. So I encourage you to think about your everyday power, particularly if you're mid-career, then you have some power to lift up the women around you. And they also organised, or individually, either they all organised small collectives or they worked individually to go out on a limb over some particular inequalities. So I don't know about you, but certainly I have noticed in my workplace outbreaks of inequality. Now, do we turn a blind eye or do we use our power selectively while sustaining our own positions to go out on a limb to protest about those situations? And I like the concept of tempered radicalism because it doesn't mean you're out there all the time, but it does mean that you're out there some of the time and that you're using your power on an everyday basis to lift up the women around you. And we're an equalities centre, so we're interested in gender equality, but we're also obviously interested in all the intersecting other areas of inequality and how they interconnect and how they're lived out, for example, in the lives of different women. So, for example, I've been doing a project in the social housing sector in Greater Manchester for a few years now, and we've just got funding to deliver that for another 3 years of raising roots for Black and minoritized ethnic leadership. So then we start thinking about how does gender and ethnic and racial relations intersect in the lived reality of people working in that sector. So this is Grau. We started thinking about getting started, young women's lives, investing in training that works for women, developing monitoring, mentoring and sponsoring. So the sponsoring bit is what I want to talk about today here. Leadership pathways and family lives. And I should say here, we're going to talk about progression, but if you don't want to progress, that's all right. Career pathways aren't linear. They're not, you know, this is a masculine norm. So that you start at the beginning and you go up like that. I mean, not only do a lot of us not have the opportunity to do that, but a lot of other things get in the way. And it's not, in my experience, just children, because quite soon after children comes elder care. And so there are a number of reasons. There may also be health and other reasons why women don't, you know, pursue a relentlessly upward full-time career. But we'll perhaps come on and talk about this, but the literature pre-COVID showed that women very much traded off flexibility for pay. So my question post-COVID is, if everybody's getting more flexibility, what about the pay that women forewent in order to have their flexible working arrangements? So it's not always about progressing, it's about making sure you're having fair pay for the work that you're doing. Returning and recharging, so, you know, an interrelated issue. And then in valuing midlife women, we talked in particular about ageism in the workplace and also menopause. So we're kind of scooting over the menopause bit, but we might think about ageism. But I think here we're probably not talking about people who are towards the end of their careers. I think we're probably, well, age isn't everything, is it? It depends what your leadership pathway's been. Well, you talk about whatever matters to you in your breakout groups, because that's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk for about another 10 minutes, and then you're going to go into breakout groups and think about how does this hit with your lives. So I'm going to talk about feminisms. There isn't one feminism. There's no one feminist discourse, and there's no feminist God who decides what's feminist and what's not. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about in a minute is some academic research which kind of treats feminist discourses as cultural objects. It doesn't necessarily promote an idea, but it says, oh, I'm detecting in the zeitgeist that there are this set of ideas. Okay, so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to think about it, how it relates practically. And I'm not sure the research has been done on this, so we're in new areas, right? But I mean, there's been research on these things, but not necessarily how feminist discourses, or how you would see feminist discourses relating to these. Relate to obtaining fair pay or a pay rise, gaining sponsorship for progression. And the reason I've focused on sponsorship is because the literature tells us that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. So by sponsored, what I mean is that somebody is picking you as a winner. Somebody is lifting you up to the people who've got power in progression processes. Somebody is singing your praises in all the right places, taking you to the right places, giving you access, giving you more challenging projects. In our Getting Started inquiry tool that within the Grau toolkit, we talk about how in apprenticeships, there's some evidence that young women are given less challenging tasks. Some sort of paternalistic protection means that they're given less challenging tasks, but that means they've got less chance to shine, which means it's less chance the job will turn, the apprenticeship will turn into a really good job. So part of sponsorship sometimes is giving somebody a really challenging job, or saying to them, you could do more than this. Do you know that you could do more than this? I don't know about you, but it took for people to tap me on the shoulder and say, you can be this, you could do this, for me to see it in myself. And partly because as women, we're taught that ambition is something dirty. And then there's, of course, the balancing work and family life bit. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to talk about these for long, but you know them of old. So the gender pay gap in the UK in 21 is 15.4. It's actually come down slightly during the pandemic, but that's because a lot of women left work during the pandemic. So we need to really look at what's the gender pay gap going to be over the next couple of years. There's lots of missing women from the labour force who, because of homeschooling, felt they had no choice but to leave the labour market. We don't know yet if they'll come back. And equal pay day is the 18th of November. So it's a cheery thought, isn't it, to think you're working for free after the 18th of November, during that really difficult month when you're also juggling getting ready for Christmas. The gender pay gap is caused by what we call occupational segregation and vertical segregation. So it's about the fact that men and women tend to do different types of work, and the work that women tend to do tends to be much worse paid. So the labour market is still highly sex segregated in some areas. So if you think how much it costs you to hire a plumber versus how much you pay your childminder, you can see there's vast differences in pay for people who've got similar levels of qualification. It's also about the fact that men tend to rise up career pathways higher. Now, some of this is illegal because we have the right to equal pay, but very few people ever take a case. But most of it is to do with these broader social factors. And if organisations want to close their pay gap, they need to think about what they're paying different people for different work, and how they value that work. There's this idea of work of equal value, but how do we decide? How on earth did we decide that somebody in adult social care doing palliative care with dying should have an insecure contract and £10 an hour? You know, how do we as a society decide that's fair pay? So, you know, we have to really ask ourselves some deeper questions. But it's also obviously about that progression point. So how does this relate to you? So I think that women need to think about a bit more consciously about the sectors they're going into. And in particular, young women. If you've got a young woman in your life, make her aware of these massive pay differences. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't value hairdressing and beauty and childcare and social care and all the low-paid female-dominated sectors. I think they should be better paid. But if I've got a young woman sat in front of me, I want her to be really, really aware of the vast difference in her pay prospects when she considers one of those sectors. And of course, for you and most of you on the call will be professionals, it's about progression. But I believe that within the professions as well, there's parts of the professions that are better paid than others. So I think it's about being maybe a bit more conscious about where we position ourselves and also challenging the underpay or the pay differential between work of equal value. So I've already said this really, that we need women to be picked out and sponsored. I mean, essentially the old boys network was that men were sponsored. Only you will know how alive and well the old boy network is in your organisation and profession. How much of it goes on in after work events, to which it might be more difficult for some women at particular times in life course to get, or around activities that are traditionally masculine, or what's not, those days have changed. How much decisions are made down the pub. I mean, I'm not saying that your HR department make decisions down the pub. I'm talking about the before the meeting decision that's made before the HR process that's made down the pub. And I'm also talking about that, just that gossip within sectors, who's good, who do you employ, that kind of thing in my sector certainly is massively powerful in terms of who gets what kind of roles. So who are you sponsoring and who's sponsoring you? And what can you do about it? Is an interesting question for you to all think about it. Okay, but what can you do about it? In terms of synchronising women's leadership pathways and family lives, my view is that we're in this sort of dual place at the moment, whereby because men are doing, thankfully, more care, you can talk about your children at work, I think, often more than you could have done 10 years ago, or your elderly parents, or whatever's going on for you. But the underlying, unrelenting, high demand work, the workload issue hasn't necessarily been resolved. Again, only you will know how well that lands in your sector. So in the pandemic, this was writ large when organisations were sending out messages saying, look after yourself, look after your families. And by the way, we've got to innovate like mad. Can you get back online and let's do this, that and the other? And the contradiction therein, and organisations were put in a very difficult position because the government chose not to give any remuneration to women or families for homeschooling. They chose to do a massive thing, which was close schools and close nurseries and close access to any sort of childcare without giving any remuneration or right to furlough for those carers. And they just left it for individual women to kind of make sense of. Those of us who work from home with older children coped. Goodness only knows when you have younger children, a child with a disability, or you don't work from home, how did you cope? And this is going to have rumbling effects for women going forward. This was a government decision. The government created all sorts of schemes. They could have created a gender sensitive scheme. They could have valued care. So the argument in the literature is this idea of the ideal worker as the man who's willing and unpolluted by domestic responsibilities and ever available and ever upwards on this linear career is still the ideal against which everything else is judged. But maybe times have changed. So I'll be really interested to hear from you about whether or not you really think that that ideal has been shifted. I'm not saying there aren't accommodations around it, but is the ideal still at the centre of your working life? So how on earth has this got anything to do with feminisms? So I'm going to really briefly talk you through a description of what, not me, other gender theorists have said they think are common discourses, in other words, languages, conversations, ways of making sense, emerging common senses about where we are with feminism. So very much in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s was something that we call post-feminism. And a lot of people argue this isn't feminism at all because it isn't about women lifting each other up and it isn't about tackling social inequality. It is actually the repudiation of feminism. It's saying feminism isn't needed anymore. That because life outcomes are now the product of choice, women have got a lot of choices and hard-earned personal merit. The surface impression was that women have a lot of life options and pathways for success. The notion that there are common barriers, such as gender divisions of labour in the household or at work, and occupational segregation, that idea of, you know, some work being valued more than others, is redundant because women have got choice. If women go and work in social care, that's their choice. If women choose to stay at home, that's their choice. Issues of whether or not they couldn't access childcare, couldn't pay for childcare, those are gone. We're free. There's no need for women or for any sort of collective action. And in fact, we can deride women who go onto television as feminists as like these terrible, I don't know, dry lesbian killjoys. This is basically the kind of caricature that's used to keep us silent. You're going to notice I've got some bias. You might want to think that's how I see the world, and I think that's true, and that's fine. I really, really want you to think about which of these do you think is a good description of reality. And then came along Lean In, Sandberg, epitomised, I don't think she invented it, she epitomised an emerging idea where high-profile women were beginning to acknowledge inequalities, and some called themselves feminists. But when you look closer at what they say, there's no real focus on changing social systems. And the language of traditional feminism, such as women having autonomy, which is really important around the abortions debate, women having rights, women being liberated from domestic drudgery in particular, or from having to provide sexual service to their husbands, remembering that rape in marriage is quite a new legal affair, or notions of social justice just don't exist in this worldview. Essentially, this approach is about being entrepreneurial and having a kind of makeover approach to life, solving inequality by competing whilst being resilient and happy, not angry. So this is really about saying barriers exist, but hey girls, if we compete, we can overcome. And if we do it with a happy face, then we're real women, because we're running happy families and we're being charming at work. And you know the woman, and I've been that woman, who's the token woman who gets into the male set and you're charming and you're funny and you overlook this and that, and you cover certain things up. And it's much easier in my experience until you have children and when you're young. And what's outlawed is anger or disquiet. So this is you might see it as a sort of progress after post-feminism, in my view. This is, anyway, I'm again bringing my own biases in. But it's not the full package as far as I'm concerned. However, this might be, you might recognize yourself here. I mean, you might recognize yourself and think, oh, hang on a minute. Yeah, actually, there's something like, you know, maybe I can challenge myself on this. Or you might recognize yourself and go, yeah, no, that is how it is. You can make it. You just got to try really hard. You've got to be really blooming amazing at juggling. You've got to work really, really effectively. And you've got to do it with a smile on your face. And that's the way to do it. And then we've had the kind of Me Too movement, which the feminist theorist that I was reading recently was arguing grows out of girl power. So, you know, this is what we really, really want, girls. It's strongly related to having consumer power. And it's almost as if wearing or seeing feminism is the same as changing patriarchal structures. If we put feminism on as a t-shirt, what does it change? I'm not saying we shouldn't wear the t-shirt, but what does it change? And then there's the idea that, in fact, these ideas have been wrapped into corporations and they've started to use them to their own good advantage. So celebrities and corporates have started to have a kind of affirmative and happy activism. And when we were running Grow, what we found was that organisations really, really wanted to talk to us about gender equality. And very few of them really, really wanted to change or spend any money on changing. They really, really wanted to talk to us about it, though. So it's almost like feminism got captured by markets and corporations. And it was still very much outlawed to be the feminist killjoy who perhaps pointed this out, who perhaps pointed out that, if I give you an example from my own working life, I'm often asked to go to events where I talk about women progressing in academia. And when I go to those events, often other women, other professors in good spirits stand up and they talk about how they hardly saw their children, how their bodies went to pot, how they worked like absolute hell, and how they've made it. And I know that that does violence to the young women in the audience, because it tells them that, girls, that's the price you have to pay. I will not stand on that platform and talk about that. But the truth is, I did nearly kill myself to get promoted. So I did do those things, but I won't do that to the next generation. What I will do is I will go and fight internally to point out the contradiction between the messages around equality and the car crash of that hitting up against unrealistic workloads, for example, or piling on work the minute someone gets back from maternity leave or whatever. So we've won, for example, that somebody gets research leave when they get back from maternity leave, because you had no chance to pursue your research during that period. And research is like a train, it doesn't stop, you know, if you can't just get off for a while. So we try and make small changes that make really more deeper effects on women's lives. And there's also this idea of women's representation. Does just add women and stir really work? If you have more women at the board table, no doubt a good thing. Do they represent all women? Do the kind of women who get to the board table represent all women? And I'm not deriding those women, but they are working within a context, aren't they? There's only so much they can do. So sometimes I mean, and women on the call will recognise this. If you've got to be the woman on the interview panel every single time, then you can't get on with your day job. So we do need women's representation, but I'm not sure that it's all that we need. Me Too, of course, has been primarily about sexual harassment. And I think that these feminist theorists who've written all these things I put in this slide have gone a bit too far, because I think that we are growing a generation of young women who are pointing out really deep structural reasons why sexual abuse against women has been tolerated. They are pushing for deeper change. They're causing massive disruption to the police force. And I think it is less likely, certainly in my career, that you will be sexually harassed now than you would have done 30 years ago. 30 years ago, in my profession, it was pretty common. If you talk about women who are 15 years older than me, it was every day. Now, I'd like to think that a woman could come to me. In the hospitality sector, private dining, no. It's still going on. It's still going on in pubs and bars and goodness knows what. So it's not gone. And some of the women who've got the least power are the ones that are still experiencing it. But I hope that those young women do feel now more able to speak out as a result of the Me Too movement. But we're still not really talking about the fact that most violence against women goes on within families. So this isn't my form of feminism, but this is the one to which I subscribe, or at least, if I'm being honest, I try to subscribe, because the pull of the others, because I work in an organisation where I have to compete and I have to be individually successful, etc., can be, you know, I'm pulled by those other logics. But I also subscribe to a more critical feminism. And I was thinking about what would you call this? And I was thinking, for me, it does feel like feminist friendship, because actually, these are the places where I have really good, deep, professional friendships. And these are the places where we recognise and work to change structures that cause gender inequality. Maybe not every day. We're tempered radicals. We use our power every day. But we also only go out on the limb occasionally. Where I try to support collectives. So I'm going to talk at the end, if you give me a minute at the end of the session, to talk about GM for Women. I don't know if you know about GM for Women, but it's a collective of all women's organisations and campaigns in Greater Manchester who've come together, emerging out of the centenary of suffrage and all the great celebrations we had, to look for change. And they're now working with the Girls and Women panel, which is part of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, to try and to activate change. And I run something called the Women's Enterprise Policy Group, so I'm a professor of entrepreneurship. So my job is to try and bring the evidence to the table and think about women's enterprise. I try to celebrate women's awesome bodies and their labour, rather than disguising those things, to always be the voice that will value care, point out to how much society needs care labour, because these are the issues, aren't they, whereby, you know, fundamentally we live in a world where paid work is paid and care work isn't, in the family. I try to give women awareness, voice and collectives, and I try to foster tempered radicalism. So, of course, I do compete. My whole job is really founded on making sure that myself and my team compete. But that there's ways of doing competition, aren't there? And there's lots and lots of ways in which we can also lift up others. So what the hell has this then got to do with the three issues that we want to talk about? You might want to take a photo of this slide to talk about in your breakout groups, because I'm going to ask you to think about the 4 feminisms and your career. So just to summarise, post-feminism, there's no problem here, girls, crack on and have it all. Neoliberal feminism, well, we're entrepreneurs creatively overcoming inequality in our own lives to be balanced, happy women. There's popular feminism, which is loud and proud, but what's it really changing? Or I would ask, in organisations, what's it really changing? Have we really got a popular feminism for workplace issues? There's a popular feminism for sexual abuse issues, I think. Do we have a popular feminism for organisational change that's pushing for change? Remember, we only got maternity leave through massive campaigning. You know, the things that we take for granted, and I mean, and look at what's just happened in America. We cannot, and Helen Pankhurst would say to me all the time, when you can't see progress, know that you are helping to stop the backsliding. Be ever present that women's rights are not fully assured, that we must keep making the argument for them. And then what I call critical feminism, where working individually and collectively through small changes and large for empowerment for women. So just helping you to bridge these two things very quickly then. If we take something like fair pay. So in post-feminism, it would be literally about asking, speaking up individually, come on, crack on, get on with it. If you haven't got the courage to do it, that's your problem. In neoliberal feminism, it would, or indeed in post-feminism, it could even be about denying the fact that the problem existed in the first place. In neoliberal feminism, it could be about sympathising that there was a problem, but still very much putting the solution to the problem in the hands of the woman suffering a lack of fair pay. But nevertheless, doing something, empowering her to speak up. In popular feminism, I'm not even sure we're talking about issues like pay, sponsorship and work-life balance. So at the moment in popular feminism, I'm not sure those issues even really exist. I don't know if you're aware of an organisation called Pregnant Then Screwed, which is run by one of my dear and lovely friend, Jolie Brearley, who is really speaking up about this work-life balance issue and the undervaluing of mothering, and how that's, you know, how there are big structural underlying issues in our welfare system, and if you actually look at maternity rights, and they don't apply to everybody, and she's really making waves. Well, that is kind of a popular feminism for me around work-life balance. But how, you know, we need to build volume, in my view, around that. And so critical feminism is really, I suppose, a kind of popular feminism for these issues, the issues that I'm interested in, bringing the noise forward from sexual abuse into these other issues. So I'll go back to you, Michelle, and
yeah,
you want to take a photo of this slide as well.
What I'm conscious of is it's massive food for thought. I've made quite a lot of notes there. I think we might keep the breakouts maybe to 12 minutes. I was thinking, Rachel, just so that we can come back to Julia for a minute or two before closing off, if that's okay with you.
I've spoken too long, I'm sorry.
Well, it's your passion and enthusiasm, and in fairness, I think it's super thought-provoking. So I think for everyone, you don't need to press anything. I think we'll all be automatically taken into breakout groups. So we'll see you in there. Thank you.